Is Donald Trump a racist? Some people certainly think so. And in this video, I'm going to evaluate the claims of people who believe that. But this video is meant to be more than that. It's actually meant to be an opportunity to see the impact that media representation, framing, and nuance, or lack thereof, has on our perception of politicians. And at the end of the video, my hope is that you leave feeling more informed and like you understand the various perspectives on Donald Trump and the claims that he's a racist. To start things off, I found this video from a gentleman who put together a series of pieces of evidence that he uses to justify his claim that Trump is a white supremacist. And it's a pretty good video that actually is a good representation of the argument that Trump's a racist. So I want you to check this out before I break it down point by point so that you can form your own conclusions. Check it out.
I referenced white supremacy in the post about Donald Trump, and people showed up in droves to tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. And I realized that people don't know what white supremacy is. People wouldn't know white supremacy if it stood in front of a camera and offered reparations to white people who fell victim to equity initiatives. If it promised to accelerate the defunding of public education that started after desegregation. If it hosted a rally where a speaker called a colonized island a pile of garbage and said that black people carved watermelons for Halloween. If it blamed immigrants for economic problems and promised a mass deportation. If it called black and brown countries shitholes while saying it preferred immigrants from Norway. If it called for white supremacist groups to stand by. If it told congresswomen of color to go back to their countries. If it called for a ban of Muslims entering the country. If it took out a full-page ad in newspapers to call for the execution of 5 black and brown teenagers for a crime they didn't commit. If it was successfully sued for refusing to rent homes to black people because its practices were too racist for the 1970s. If it pushed a racist conspiracy theory that the country's first black president was a secretly foreign-born Muslim. People wouldn't know white supremacy if white supremacist groups jumped for joy at its election. If they banded together to rush the Capitol building when he lost.
The first claim in the video is pointing out the fact that Trump said that he wants to provide restitution to people who are victims of discriminatory practices under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Specifically, if you look at the context of the statement, Trump is talking especially about schools that have used policies like affirmative action. Now, here are the facts. Affirmative action is a form of discrimination. The question isn't whether affirmative action is a form of discrimination, it's a question of whether that form of discrimination is justified. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that no, it's not. But you might disagree with the Supreme Court and you think that we need present discrimination to make up for the effects of past discrimination, which is a reasonable position. But here I actually have a personal perspective to offer on things. I'm black. I also went to Harvard. I'm also a first-generation African immigrant. My parents come from Ghana. It's actually not all that clear to me why I need to get a benefit in college admissions over someone who might, for example, be a low-income Asian immigrant. For example, there are sects of the Asian population that have had it really hard. Take, for example, the Hmong people. The Hmong people who are persecuted in China, Laos, and Vietnam. In present day, the level of educational attainment by the Hmong people is comparable to black people, and they actually have a higher rate of poverty. So it's actually not all that clear why I need to have an affirmative action benefit over someone from the Hmong people. But as it pertains to Trump, there's a reasonable question to be asked of, well, if DEI policies like affirmative action are inherently discriminatory, does it make sense to continue to have discriminatory practices? And if someone opposes having those discriminatory practices, does that make them a racist? The second claim in the video is essentially about defunding the Department of Education or even shutting it down, which sounds alarming to many people. And as the poster pointed out, the point of the Department of Education, what was refounded in 1979, was to help protect civil rights. But there's also a question of, is the Department of Education effectively doing what it's supposed to be doing in current day in 2024? The Department of Education has about $80 billion of budget. And one of the things that it's supposed to be doing is making the American populace more educated and well-equipped to compete on the international scale. It's also meant to help close the achievement gap between white people and racial minorities. But since the Department of Education has been founded, the achievement gap has not closed. And it's hard to argue that it's really close to any significant degree at all as a result of Department of Education. Additionally, when it comes to other first world nations, America is lagging behind, especially when it comes to math and science. So there's a legitimate question to ask of, Does the Department of Education actually need to even exist in order to get the outcomes that we want? Is it effective at creating the outcomes that we want? And if the point of it is to protect people's civil rights, which is of course important, are there other ways that we can do that without funding an $80 billion department that is not doing the other things that it's supposed to be doing well? At a Trump rally, they had a speaker talk about black people carving watermelons and call Puerto Rico an island of garbage. And of course, that on its face sounds really bad. But here again, nuance and context is important. The speaker in question is actually a professional insult and roast comedian named Tony Hinchcliffe. He has a very popular show called Kill Tony. His whole job and career is making fun of people, and he does it to everyone. White, brown, black, Asian, he's not particular.
He's been using the stool that Aaron Hernandez kicked out from under himself. Kevin is so small that when his ancestors picked cotton, they called it deadlifting. Tom Brady is a patriot, which is surprising considering he looks like a Confederate fag. Clearly your ex-wife takes after you. I hear she's out there draining balls right now.
Now, you might argue that him showing up at a rally and doing what he does professionally, but doing that to an audience of politically minded individuals is a bad look. And I'd agree. But let me first ask you, if Kevin Hart or Dave Chappelle had made fun of white people at a Kamala rally, would you be outraged about that? And even if you think it's in poor taste for any comedian to be at a rally, it's important to actually look at what they said. If you look at Tony Hinchcliffe's comments about Puerto Rico, for example, he did call Puerto Rico an island of garbage. And it turns out that Puerto Rico has a significant public sanitation and landfill problem. Their landfills are literally overflowing with garbage. And you might not find that funny, but you can at least understand why a comedian is making a joke like that. The next claim is about Trump's immigration policies and him infamously referring to other countries as shithole countries and saying that he would prefer to have immigrants come from Norway. Now, you could choose to view this through a racial lens, but I want to invite you to look at this another way. America is the most desired country to be in on the planet. And we know this because we have both the highest rates of illegal and legal immigration in the world. And the reason why it's so desirable to be in America is because, well, it's a lot better off than a lot of other countries. Many other countries elsewhere in the world are essentially failed states. They're war-torn, economically riven, and of course there's people trying to leave them in droves. And of course we want to have compassion for that because every human being wants to have the best experience of this one life that they can possibly have. At the same time, we can't just allow anyone into the country. Now, is it rude for Trump to refer to other countries as shitholes? Absolutely. But it's also the case that a lot of these countries are just not as good to live in as America is. So the question is, what criteria would you apply when deciding who you allow into the country? The next claim is that Trump told a white supremacist group to stand by and stand down. But we got to look deeper here. It turns out that the group that he was referring to specifically is called the Proud Boys. And the leader of the Proud Boys was actually an Afro-Cuban man named Enrico Tarrio. In addition to that, the Proud Boys' explicit mandate is not to support white supremacy. Instead, the Proud Boys describe themselves as a Western chauvinist group. Now, you might consider that unsavory and odious, but in reality, what they espouse themselves to stand for is Western pride, pro-gun rights, having more stringent rules on who gets to enter the country as an immigrant, male camaraderie, masculinity, traditional gender roles. And they view themselves as an oppositional force to woke culture, political correctness, and the excesses of the far left. Now, it is worth noting that the Proud Boys does have some connection to white supremacist groups, but they're not a white supremacist group themselves. And I leave it up to you to decide whether Trump espousing a group that stands for Western pride also makes him a white supremacist. The next claim is that Trump told progressive congresswomen to go back to the country that they came from. So here, it's important to get specific. So I'm actually going to read you the exact quote. The quote is, "It's so interesting to see quote-unquote progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Trump didn't specifically call out any congresswomen, but one can infer that one of those congresswomen was a woman named Ilhan Omar, a refugee from Somalia. Now, Trump's claim here isn't about race, it's about nations. And Somalia is a poorly run nation. That's exactly why Ilhan Omar is a refugee from Somalia. So again, you could choose to view this through a racial lens, or you can view it through a national lens and acknowledge the reality that, yes, there are more and less desirable countries to live in. Let's evaluate the next claim about banning Muslims from entering the country. What is being pointed out here is that during Trump's first term, a series of executive orders was signed originally targeting Muslim countries and having more stringent requirements on immigrants entering America from those countries. Here, it's important to understand the intention behind the executive orders, not just the headline. The intention was to make sure that those other countries were cooperative with the United States in making sure that they were doing criminal background checks, or installing security measures like biometric data on electronic passports so that we understood who we were allowing into their countries. So, in short, it was a national security measure that was meant to pressure those countries into meeting America's standards for legal immigration. It's also worth noting that the executive order was expanded to not only include Muslim countries, but also immigrants from countries like North Korea or Venezuela. The next claim is about the Central Park Five. Now, for those of you who don't know, in 1989, Trump took out an ad in a newspaper calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty for muggers and killers and rapists. And it's important to understand the context of what was happening in New York City at the time that he took out that ad. In 1989, the Central Park Five was a group of black and brown men who were accused of raping a woman in Central Park. At the time, everyone assumed that those men were guilty. When Trump took out the ad, 1989 was one of the worst years of criminal activity in the history of New York City. There was rampant crime. Furthermore, Trump didn't call specifically for the Central Park Five to get the death penalty. He was calling in general for criminals who committed heinous acts to get the death penalty. And that was the context there. So again, you can choose to view this through a racial lens, but let's keep in mind that at that time, there was a huge problem with crime in New York City. And furthermore, people didn't know that the Central Park Five were actually innocent. That only came to light a decade later in 2002 when they were eventually exonerated. The next claim here, I would say, is probably the most damning. And it's a claim that Donald Trump and his father were sued for discriminatory housing practices when they owned real estate in New York. It is true that they were sued. Now, they never were actually prosecuted. They arrived at a settlement with the Department of Justice in exchange for changing some of their discriminatory practices. And it's also worth noting the historical context because the 60s and the 70s were a low point for racism in America. It was a racist time where there was unfortunately a lot of discrimination. And it does look like Trump and his father participated in that. Now, it's unclear how much of this was actually racially motivated versus a heuristic that they were applying because they were trying to run a successful business. Now, even if it's the latter, it doesn't make it okay. And it's good that they were sued by the Department of Justice. But it's important to distinguish between a racially motivated act and discrimination that is meant to basically comply with what was a normal standard, unfortunately, in housing practices in real estate in the 70s. And I leave it up to you to decide whether actions taken 40 years ago are dispositive of the idea that Trump is a white supremacist. The next claim is about the birther conspiracy against Obama. Do you guys remember when Obama was being accused of actually not being born in America and people were demanding his birth certificate? Well, Trump was one of those people. But what you might not know is that eventually, in 2016, Trump admitted Obama was born in America.
President Barack Obama was born in the United States, period. Now we all want to get back to making America strong and great again.
Now, you can argue that this was racially motivated because absolutely, there were avowed racists who were pushing the birther conspiracy. But it's also true that there were many people who had genuine questions about whether Obama had been born in the US. So I leave it up to you to decide, was this just political blood sport in action and what Democrats and Republicans have always been doing to each other? Or was this racism? Now let's evaluate the next more general claim, which is that white supremacists were jumping for joy or felt emboldened by Trump. I think it's actually fair to say one thing of Trump. He is a nationalist. Whether he's a white nationalist is up to you. But being a nationalist is different than being a white nationalist. A nationalist might believe that we should prioritize America first. A nationalist might believe that America is the greatest country on earth and believe that there's an exceptionalism to American values. And there's an overlap between the beliefs of a nationalist and a white nationalist. So it's fair to say that the mere appearance of Trump did embolden white nationalists. But I leave it up to you to decide. Did he embolden white nationalists because he's a white nationalist himself, or because he's a nationalist and those nationalists who were white nationalists felt emboldened by someone who at least partially reflects their views? Now, as far as January 6th, this is a really complicated one. And if you're interested, I have another video on my profile breaking down January 6th and the motivations behind it. But what I'll say here is to reduce January 6th down to some sort of racist rally or white nationalist storming the Capitol is an immense oversimplification of what was happening. Because remember, the context of January 6th was that people thought the election had been stolen. And there's actually something to that, because what we do know factually is that the government was conspiring with Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to suppress conservative voices and to suppress voices that were skeptical of some of the vaccine mandates. And ultimately, some of these same platforms actually censored stories like the Hunter Biden laptop story that made the Democratic Party look bad. So was the election stolen? I don't know. But what I do know is that there was election interference, and that was a primary motivation behind January 6th. But was it a primarily racist rally? I don't think so. Now that we've addressed the claims in the video, here are two bonus claims based on two of the most famous incidents that critics of Trump point to as evidence of him being a racist. First, do you remember the media reporting that Trump called white supremacists very fine people? Well, there's a lot more context here that's worth keeping in mind. In Charlottesville, there was a statue of Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate leader. There were people who were moving to have the statue taken down because they believed that the Confederate statue represented slavery and they wanted to move on from that dark part of America's history. People on the other side, however, argued that they wanted the statue to stay up because it represented much more than just slavery and actually represented Southern traditions and pride and independence and a heritage that they did not want to get taken down just because it was tied to slavery. Now, there were multiple camps on the side that wanted to keep the statue up, some of which were the people that I described, and some people who were genuine white supremacists. Things came to a head in August when a group of white supremacists holding a rally clashed with a group of people who were resisting them, and things got messy and it got violent. It's unclear exactly who was present and in what proportions on that day, but what we know for a fact is that there were definitely white supremacists at that rally, and most of the rally was actually organized by them. But there's also evidence that suggests that there were people who were not white supremacists, who had a reasonable stance and wanted the statue to stay up because of Southern tradition. When commenting on the incident days later, Trump said that he thought they were very fine people on both sides.
And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Now, the uncharitable way of viewing this is, well, it was a white supremacist rally, and if he's calling very fine people on both sides, then he's referring to white supremacists as very fine people. But the media didn't show you the entire clip, because later in that same exact speech, he explicitly condemns neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists.
Lastly, and perhaps most infamously, Trump saying that Haitians in Springfield, Ohio were eating dogs and cats. Now, first it's important to understand what's actually happening in Springfield, Ohio. Certain people who enter the country legally Some enter the country illegally, and some are somewhere in between. You see, there's an asylum seeker program that's available for victims of natural disasters and political persecution. Now, if you'll recall, years ago, there was an earthquake in Haiti, and that led to some refugees coming from Haiti and seeking asylum status in the US. Now, these people were granted asylum status, and it was given temporary protected status, meaning that they could be here for a period of time, but the intention was never that they get to stay here for an extended period of time. Many of these Haitian immigrants ended up in Springfield, Ohio, a small town that wasn't really ready to accommodate tens of thousands of Haitian immigrants for an extended period of time. As a result, what's happened in this community is there's been quite a lot of pressure on a lot of the social systems. Hospitals are being overrun. Housing is an issue. Social services are being strained. Now, Trump said pretty explicitly that the immigrants are eating dogs and cats, and there's not conclusive evidence of that. However, J.D. Vance did say that they had sources who told them that.
First of all, city officials have not said it's not true. They've said they don't have all the evidence.
They said they have no evidence.
We've heard from a number of constituents on the ground, Caitlin, who both firsthand and secondhand reports saying this stuff is happening.
So there's two ways to look at this. Either they had sources and the mainstream media wasn't reporting on them, or it's possible that it's not true and J.D. Vance and Trump were told the wrong thing and they were just kind of going off of what they were told. Here, I think it's a fair criticism to say that if they're not 100% sure that Haitian immigrants were eating dogs and cats, they should have made clear that they're not sure and they had just heard things. So here, I think it's fair to say that Trump was very careless in saying something that is clearly an inflammatory claim and needs to be backed up. Proponents might argue that Trump shoots from the hip and sometimes the aim is a bit off, but ultimately he was directionally correct because there is a genuine issue with trying to integrate the immigrant population from Haiti in Springfield, Ohio. So now that we've evaluated some of the specific claims that are being levied in support of the idea that Trump is a racist, I want us to actually go back in time to before when Trump actually ran for office. Because before he ran for office, Black people weren't calling him a racist. In fact, it was much to the contrary. Check out this video.
And she likes me. She even put me in her movies.
I was just going to say.
She put me in her movies,
yes,
right?
we
A
are
long time ago.
friends.
And how much did I charge? Nothing.
Like they say in the
It was a freebie.
Donald,
Donnie, I love you.
Nelson Mandela and 80 of his constituents were trying to come to the United States.
Yeah.
The United States government wasn't helping him. No one was helping him. You chartered a 727 plane for their entire trip.
Yeah.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
Probably not, but I do get tired of seeing the country ripped off.
Why would you not?
I just don't think I really have the inclination to do it. I love what I'm doing. I really like it.
Also, it doesn't pay as well.
No, it doesn't.
I now want to bring forth a friend beyond that in terms of reaching out and being inclusive. He's done that too. And created for many people a comfort zone when I ran for the presidency in 84 and 88, and opportunities to embrace the underserved communities. Donald Trump.
Now, so far in this video, we've been pretty much just responding to negative claims about Trump. But it's interesting to note that many people don't know the positive things that happened during Trump's first term for Black and brown people in this country. For example, did you know that under Trump, one of the most historic and impactful criminal justice reform bills was passed? And at the time, Black pundits were celebrating it as a victory for bipartisan collaboration to help minorities.
This is history. This is history. Right now, you're witnessing history on the floor of the U.S. Senate. There's a Christmas miracle underway where, for the first time in a generation, Republicans and Democrats are arm in arm tonight saying, we are sending too many people to prison. They're coming out bitter and not better. We want to make a tremendous difference. I want to say Hakeem Jeffries on the left, Jared Kushner, and Donald Trump on the right have brought together a coalition like I've never seen.
Furthermore, there was actually historically low unemployment under Trump for both Blacks and Hispanics in the country. And on top of that all, Trump actually signed a bill that authorized $250 million to go to historically Black colleges and universities. So why is that never brought up when we're talking about whether Trump is a racist? Now, I'm actually going to talk about why I think Trump keeps on getting painted as a racist. But before we even get into that, let's concede for a second that he is. Let's say that Trump actually is a racist and he has a racist agenda. Well, then my question is, what actually happened during his first term that was racially targeted, that actually made your experience as a minority directly worse? And everyone's gonna have different answers to the question, but it's important to escape the world of generalities and get into specifics. And my question for Black Americans especially is, how was your life worse under Trump from a policy perspective? Were you worse off economically? Were you experiencing more discrimination by the government or institutions? If he is racist, what specifically are you concerned that he's going to do? What specific policies, what specific benefits is he going to be taking away from you? And to be clear, I'm not saying he's not going to do anything. What I'm doing is inviting you to consider, what specifically are you concerned about? And it's also worth noting that it's also possible for someone to be a racist and still do things that benefit you. Lyndon B. Johnson is known for having dropped the N-word regularly in private discussions. And he's also the guy who signed the Civil Rights Act. Now, I want to offer some personal thoughts on whether Trump is a racist. In my view, if he is, he's not particularly more racist than the average person. And my view is that everyone's a bit racist. And it's not because people are consciously trying to be, it's because we all have unconscious biases. That's part of being human. We all have heuristics that we apply when we meet someone, meaning we all literally prejudge someone before we know them. And it can lead to some really ugly outcomes that we need to make sure that we're addressing. And I also think, in large part, many of those outcomes have been addressed. Institutional racism in our government is not nearly as prevalent as it used to be before. Minorities have the right to vote. Voter suppression is largely a thing of the past. And although there are racial gaps in achievement as a result of past racism, using present discrimination to correct past discrimination just continues the cycle of discrimination. And it actually builds resentment in the group that feels like they're discriminated against. In this case, largely white people. Or in the case of affirmative action, Asian people as well. And we do reach a point as a society where a bigger problem than racism itself is constantly calling everything the product of racism. Now, is racism still a problem in this country? Of course it is, and it always will be. It will always be a problem in humanity more generally. So the question to ask yourself is how big of a problem it is, and not qualitatively, quantitatively. For instance, how would you actually know that racism is at an acceptable degree for you to go on and achieve the things that you want to achieve in your life? It can be easy to hand wave and talk about systemic racism and these really vague terms that, frankly, just confuse the discussion rather than make it precise and specific. So my invitation to everyone when we're talking about topics like race is, let's get really specific, and not specific about what one person said, but what are the actual examples of racism that obtain in the modern day that we need to address? And can we do that calmly and without just perpetuating more of racism by installing even more discriminatory practices? But the deeper problem is this. As Americans, I think we've been conditioned to look at everything through the lens of race. And although there are problems of racism in America, not everything is about race. And unfortunately, our politicians recognize that there's so much emotional charge about racism that I fear that they're manipulating us, especially Black people and Democrats. It's been reported that when LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, he said that he's going to have these N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Now, it's unclear whether that quote can actually be attributed to him or whether it was made up. But it does kind of point to something that I've seen in Democratic Party leadership. There's this view that if you're Black, you vote Democrat. And there's also this view that if you're Black and you don't vote Democrat, there's something wrong. I mean, look at this clip with Obama telling Black men that the reason they don't want to vote for Kamala is because she's a woman.
We have not yet seen the same kinds of energy and turnout as we saw when I was running. That seems to be more pronounced with the brothers. And I'm speaking to men directly. Part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president.
The implication here is that she's clearly just the obvious better choice for black people. And it's because she has a similar black experience that I should view as the reason I vote for her, which personally I find really condescending. And many people talk about the divisive rhetoric of Trump. And again, you can decide whether it's white nationalist rhetoric or just nationalist rhetoric. But what we don't seem to point out is the same things being done by Biden or Obama or many other Democratic politicians who have employed identity politics as a strategy for decades. For example, look at this joke by Joe Biden. And it's just a joke, but it does point to an underlying belief that I think is promulgated in the Democratic Party.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Now, here's the thing. I think we've been conditioned to look at so many things as rooted in racism. And even when the explicit forms of racism disappear, we get into very hand-wavy terminology like systemic racism or microaggression, or all these terms that are nearly impossible to identify with certitude objectively and really hard to identify when they're actually gone. And I'm not saying that racism is gone, but if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and you're gonna keep on finding nails if you just keep on brandishing a hammer. There will come a point, maybe has come already, where constantly looking for evidence of racism everywhere is actually causing more problems than racism itself. Before Obama took office, the percentage of black and white people who agreed that race relations were generally good hovered around high 60s to even 70%. After he took office and before Trump entered office, that number had plummeted to the high 40s and low 50s. Now, why is that happening? One hypothesis, and I believe this to be true, is there were genuinely white supremacists who were committing high-profile hate crimes that caused race relations to deteriorate while Obama was president. And that's unfortunate. But it's also true that Democratic politicians like Obama were engaging in identity politics. And who would blame them? Because it works. It's really easy for us to constantly point the finger at politicians and say that they're the problem. But politicians only have power that the people give them. And if we give them emotional power and mental power by constantly allowing ourselves to get riled up by every single accusation that this person is a racist and that person is going to take your rights away and this person is going to put you back in chains, then we will all forever be mentally enslaved by people who want nothing but power. So just pay attention, be nuanced, and remember, there's always a deeper story, and we all have biases, and we're the only ones who can check them for ourselves.